Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today, I want to take a look at Jordan Peterson's newest book, We Who Wrestle with God. But why this book and why on this channel? Well, it's interesting that we haven't talked about Jordan Peterson much before because he is playing such a significant role in this rebranding of Christianity or God belief in general. As we all know from all the memes, it is extremely hard to pin Jordan down on his actual belief, but that has seemed to narrow much more recently.
If I went back in time with a Panasonic video camera and put that camera in front of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
And why I want to take such a deep look at this book is mainly because of the claim that was made here.
I think I can demolish the atheistic argument permanently.
As someone who was in the faith for 30 years and who has spent a significant amount of their life thinking critically about Christianity, religion, and atheism, I couldn't resist the chance to explore this argument further. So even though that statement is extreme, Jordan Peterson is no stranger to this kind of controversy. Depending on who you ask, he is either a brilliant thinker who fearlessly tackles life's biggest questions or a provocateur prone to overreach and grandiosity. His journey into biblical analysis often raises eyebrows, especially for how he mixes mythology, psychology, and theology, sometimes with little regard for scholarly consensus or textual accuracy. But I am hopeful to approach his work here with actual curiosity and sincerity, but of course with a healthy dose of skepticism. So in this episode, we are going to unpack the first chapter of this tome of a book. This is around 500 pages and is not an easy read. If you've read anything by Jordan Peterson before, I would venture to say so far this is the most, I don't want to use the word complicated. I also don't want to poison the well and say convoluted, but let's just say you've really got to pay attention. So chapter 1 is in the beginning, and it's broken down into 5 subparts. We're going to go through each of them. Some we'll spend more time on, some we won't. And what I want to look at is, what is the case being made? Is it for Christianity or is it just for God belief? The way that Jordan Peterson talks and the way he talks in these either ors between faith and the lack of faith would have you believe that he's really just trying to say God, and he might even be redefining God. In fact, if you continue to watch the rest of the part of the clip that I showed you, he goes on to say, if one believes in good, does one really not believe in God? So if we're just going to completely change the terminologies around what we mean when we say God or religion or Christianity, then maybe he'll get his point across. But I'm going to try to hold his feet to the fire here because he's using an entire 500-page book that is filled with biblical stories. That's one specific religion. It would be one thing if he was using Hindu Vedas, Buddhist text, early Native American creation stories to kind of appeal to this, and it would still be a little bit of a fallacy, but to appeal to this majority aspect of how humanity has always sought something higher, something deeper, something greater than themselves. But when you niche down to using only Christian text to make your case, even if just metaphorically for a greater being, I think you've attached yourself to the Christian worldview and the truth claims of the text so much that you're going to have a hard time escaping. And I think we see that already in chapter 1. So I'm going to shut up with this preview and we're going to get right into it. And the first subpart here is God as a creative spirit. Jordan is making the case about what the nature of God is, that he is a character. He starts chapter 1 with, how is God presented as the great book of Genesis begins, as an animated spirit, creative, mobile, and active, something that does and is. God is, in short, a character whose personality reveals itself as the biblical story proceeds. So he's setting up a definition of God, which I hope will serve as very helpful instead of getting into the abstract of God is the sum of all parts that we can't conceive, or God is the greatest idea of good that can be imagined, these kinds of things. He's grounding it in the biblical text, which of course personifies this God into a very real and active being. Now, we're going to very quickly get into a Jordan-esque style of trying to define words and being really loosey-goosey, but I'm trying to show you that I'm taking this seriously. There's 2 words here in this early part of chapter 1 that he kind of dives into. One is the word moving, and one is the word water. And in moving, I think he's overreaching, but in water, I really see what he's getting at. So I want to show you this. Genesis opens with a confrontation. God is moving upon the face of the waters. What does moving mean? It means God is mobile, obviously, which is fine for making your case again about God being an actual character. But then he goes into, less obviously, moving is what we say when we have been struck by something deep. God is what has encountered us when new possibilities emerge and take shape. God is what we encounter when we are moved to the depths. It's pretty. It's poetic. I have no problem if we're just reading the Bible as poetry and we want to take a creative analysis class on it to do the kind of work that Jordan is doing. But if your end goal is to destroy the atheist argument, you cannot be this imprecise when dealing with simple terms. This is a creation story. We're hearing about the waters being created, and we hear that the Spirit of God moves among the face of the waters. That's it. Anything else you're going to pull out other than the fact that, okay, God has a spirit and he is mobile is completely subjective. And I think you'll see that that's going to be the case for a lot of this. So that's like sentence 4 here. And I thought to myself when I started reading, oh no, this whole thing is going to be word salad to the nth degree, and there's not going to be anything. But he surprised me because he does the same thing shortly after with the word water. And I want to try to give him some credit. What then does waters mean? Particularly the waters that God has not yet created. That in the ancient Hebrew, chaos, potential, what lurks but has not yet been revealed. As water is the precondition for life, but also harbors the unknown in its depths, God is therefore the spirit who faces chaos, who confronts the void, the deep, who voluntarily shapes what has not yet been realized and navigates the ever-transforming horizon of the future. God is the spirit who engenders the opposites, light and darkness, earth and water, as well as the possibilities that emerge from the space between them. Now here I think, and maybe I'm the one being super subjective and you can definitely criticize me for doing so, I see this as not such an overreach. I think that we do get a creation myth being presented in a particular order for a particular reason, and starting with water and representing water as kind of the chaos makes sense, not just how we functionally think about it, but in other creation myths that we see. We typically see this same kind of order laid out, and we see the same kind of striving or battle for creating order out of chaos, which is what religion is trying to accomplish after all. Early man, who has all of these gaps in their knowledge, is trying to get control, trying to establish order. Water is ever moving and flowing and cannot be pinned down, but solid earth and matter and naming and subduing is what man is and what man does. He creates order out of chaos. And if we're made in the image of a God that is doing the same thing in his creation as he separates the waters and he moves forward in the creation process, I see this as somewhat profound. Does it point to the necessity for God? Of course not. But does it help us understand something about the authors that wrote it? I think so. And so again, more than anything, this is my olive branch that I'm extending in saying, I think there can be lessons to be learned from Genesis, from the Bible, even if it's just about early man or human nature. But I also think those same things can be gleaned from any other historical account, any other creation myth, any other people group. So Jordan is going to take this to the extreme and keep building upon these ideas, these stories, more than any other ideas or stories, being so profound, so deeply woven that does it just point to God? Is this an act of genius that can be attained by man? And I don't agree with him there at all. In fact, I did a video here where I talk about other wisdom literature as compared to the wisdom books that we find in the biblical canon. And I think you can see very quickly that the Bible isn't unique enough or on a separate level to give it any kind of divinity. So the rest of what this first part of chapter 1 is doing is setting up the importance of man. So he goes through the creation order, and I'm not going to get into the biblical inaccuracies there. And he gets to the pinnacle of creation. Everything has been good. God did this, it was good. God did this, it was good. But when he created man, that was very good. And this is going to be important for a lot of the cases that he's going to continue to try to draw out from this. And to sound like Jordan Peterson, fair enough. In reading the biblical account, you can tell that we are reaching a crescendo. But let me skip forward a few pages and read this part to you. Creation culminates in the making of man and woman, and it is their creation specifically that is deemed very good. The first two human beings, and men and women in general, are thus avatars of God himself, with God as the creative spirit that calls order into being from chaos and possibility, and man and woman as a microcosm of that spirit, similar or even identical in essence, charged with forever reiterating the creation creative process. A more optimistic conception of humanity could hardly be imagined. That's what I mean. Those kinds of lines are scattered throughout what I've read so far of this book and what I know to be true of Jordan's speaking, that it's just too much. It's just too perfect. How else could we better conceive of man? The image of God that is identical, essentially, which no, it is not. So many distinctions between God and man that is supposedly created in the image of God. The first being, God cannot be tempted by evil. And yet that is the first and only test put in front of man. Not how well he gardens, not how well he names the animals, how well he can resist temptation, something God himself cannot even fathom. And that very difference leads to the eternity of differences that will be forthcoming. What I see happening here is a very positive lens of the Bible and an extreme cherry picking to get the essence out of it that you need without seeing the whole story or confronting the issues. And that's going to continue to be a problem for us as we go through this book. But let me read to you kind of his closing argument for this section. Do we believe this story? Do we believe what it states and implies? First, what does it mean to believe? We certainly act individually and collectively as if it were true, at least when we are behaving as we should, at least when we are acting in the genuinely best interest of ourselves and everyone else. We treat the people we love, and even the people we hate, as if they are indefinitely valuable loci of creative consciousness, capable of finding their way forward and creating the world that is dependent on their finding. It is the fact of this supreme identity and being that forever impedes the power-mad striving of every organization, society, or state that dares threaten individual sovereignty. The wise and the unwise alike would do well to thank the Lord for that. Well, I don't know about that. This is interesting as a main argument. He's going to expand on it. And you know what we're going to do? I'm going to call an audible. I don't want to rush through this. This is the setup for the rest of the book. I was going to cover 1.2, 3, 4, and 5. I think we'll just stick with 1.1 today. We'll do the rest of chapter 1 for episode 2. But there's some other things I wanted to show you about what Jordan has said about this book, what is written in the jacket, and other things that I think we can better fill this time with to set up a good foundation for looking into this book. So what is he pointing out here? It seems to me that he recognizes that people put people as a priority, that we all act as if people are more valuable, which is what is described in the Genesis account of people being at the pinnacle of creation. And thus, we should thank God for that, because in acting out that trueness, we benefit one another, because there's a big or else when we don't, which I'll read to you in just a minute. But this is what I think Jordan does a lot, just in listening to him and in reading him. He creates these black or white fallacies, these false dichotomies that one needs to choose from. That because people can recognize the value in other people, that must mean we are agreeing with the Genesis account of divinely inspired beings. And I'm so fascinated by this because Jordan believes in evolution, or at least he used to. I don't know if that has changed to such a degree, but we already have an answer for this. We know it was more useful to treat someone, let's just say Homo sapien to Homo sapien, better than, again, that crab on the beach. That crab's not going to do anything for you except be your food. But this other Homo sapien, this other tribe, this other group, we can trade with, we can make deals with, we can get protection from. That places an innate value, human to human, that we didn't have with other species. It says nothing of the fact that any of us are divinely made, and it doesn't take a genius or a Bible or Genesis to recognize that. And the very fact that Homo sapiens were treating each other with preference over other species long before the creation of this particular God, Yahweh, or the stories and then scriptures that would become the narrative of that God were ever even conceived of. And that's a fact that's just all too telling, that I think immediately disrupts this dichotomy. We can believe that humans are special. We can believe that we're more valuable. Jordan's going to try to pull it down to this evolutionary belief that man's not special. Yeah, it might just be a preference. It might be some fact of usefulness, which I think Jordan in a minute is about to tell us is the trueness of real truth. But there's a billion reasons why humans would have and would continue to think and act this way that have nothing to do with because we're made in the image of God, or because this is a divine setup. So let me read further, and this might clarify some things. We object, deeply offended if anyone fails to treat us as befits a child of God. That is, if anyone fails to treat us as if we truly matter. We likewise offend if we treat others as if they are beneath us, as if they are anything less than the conscious beings of sacred worth upon whose experience reality itself somehow mysteriously depends. No, that sentence is so fundamentally false and out of nowhere. It starts fine. We likewise offend if we treat others as if they are beneath us. Yes, equity is important to people. And again, there's evolutionary roots to that, or even just, if you don't want to go there, psychological basis for that. As if they are anything less than the conscious beings of sacred worth. No, you don't have to believe in the sacred. Consciousness definitely plays a part because it's what allows us to be able to give back, barter, trade, etc. But he's attaching so much here to the divine. Sacred worth upon whose experience reality itself somehow mysteriously depends. Oh, it's just so much reaching. Even if the story that we tell ourselves is this increasingly atheistic, materialistic, and fact-based world existing in skeptical contradistinction to that belief, we still believe insofar as we act out such offense, whether given or taken. No. This is what I mean. He is changing all the meanings of the words to be able to defeat the atheist argument. And I think that's really as lame as it is. Seriously, when he says, I can defeat atheism, it's by saying no one's really an atheist. Because when you act in the way that humans act, I'm going to attribute the motivations behind that to you recognizing the importance or necessity of being treated like a child of God. This insane additional sacred worth that none of us were using. How dare we base it in the materialistic, atheistic, fact-based world that he is opposing here? Why shouldn't we? Why add on these unnecessary, unproven levels to this? If you want to dress things up in mystery and sacredness for the fun of it, by all means go ahead. But to say that we require it, that we approve of it, that we actually believe in it insofar as how we act is false. And this will be the last thing that I read to you from this actual first part of the chapter, but it's an important one. So he goes on to say why we have to act this way and why we don't act on other things like people who don't believe in consciousness or free will. Well, they still treat their wife like they have free will. And, he goes into this and he says, because all hell breaks loose if we don't. And why is that? Because the presumption of intrinsic value reflects a reality that is deep enough, real enough, so that we deny it at our practical peril. And if that presumption is so absolutely necessary, how is it not true? And if that presumption that structures our very interaction is acceptance of or dramatization of the transcendent value of the individual, even ourselves, then in what manner do we not believe that value to be real? More profoundly, we may ask, at what point must it be admitted that a necessary fiction is true precisely in proportion to its necessity? Is it not the case that what is most deeply necessary to our survival is the very essence of true? Those of you who are familiar with Jordan will be very familiar with this kind of reframing of terms. Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had essentially 9 to 10 hours of doing nothing other than really debating what does true mean. So I'm not going to be able to handle it in the next 5 minutes here. Here's what I will say. What are you getting at? Do you think time actually started 6,000 years ago? That God actually breathed life into man 6,000 years ago? That Genesis is the first and only accurate account of creation? Are you calling Genesis a fiction, or do you believe that this is how it happened? These are points of clarity that many have desperately tried to get from Peterson. Alex doing a pretty good job. Dawkins really failing at it when he had his conversation with Peterson. And I don't want to be like Dawkins. That conversation was so frustrating to see Jordan completely hung up on this side and Dawkins completely hung up on here. There is some stuff in the middle. That's why I tried to accept the water metaphor. But this breaks down, and here's why. At what point must it be admitted that a necessary fiction is true precisely in proportion to its necessity? There's lots of fiction on the exact same level as the Genesis account. And I know that Jordan Peterson is well read enough to understand other creation myths that are beautiful and profound, that put hierarchy on all kinds of things, that have order defeating chaos, or at least yin-yanging with it. Like, there is no reason to give such special preference to the Bible or the Genesis account and pull it out from there. By the way, there's creation myths that are in direct opposition with Genesis. There are creation myths where there are pantheons of gods, that beget titans before you ever even get to humans. There are spirits and animations of animals and rock that have just as much divine purpose. He is actually going to cover that in the next 1.2. But But my point is there's conflicting accounts of creation that you can pull Deepities from all day long in the same way that Jordan is from the Genesis story. Nowhere, though, does that make it a necessary fiction. Necessary means required. It's this simple. If Genesis had not been written, would Homo sapiens still have existed? Yes, for a fact. As we know generally when it was written, and we know factually how long Homo sapiens have been around before that creation. We were getting along. Now, that's not to say that people were perfect before and have gotten worse, or that people were worse before and have gotten better. There's been changes like agriculture, like the Industrial Revolution, like the internet to tie us all together. There's been improvements, there's been backslides, there's been all kinds of things. But there is nothing inherently and uniquely singularly found in Genesis that is such required fiction as to transcend into truth itself. That's my argument back here. And it doesn't take much reading further into Genesis to see that these things that Jordan is kind of alluding to, that people only treat people well because we view them as having the Spirit of God manifested within them, their unique and sacred, mysterious workup of what a human is, so we are offended when that's not respected. Genesis immediately goes into slavery. Exodus gives us indentured servitude within that same people group, where you can do a few loopholes and even through an Israelite slave get him to be married and bear children that will stay in slavery for life, thus avoiding the kidnapping rule. One book later in Leviticus, we're getting into buying slaves from foreign nations. Now, slavery has always existed, and it is not caused simply by Jewish belief, but it still happened. And it happened to other cultures with different or similar creation myths. It happened before Genesis was written, and it happened after Genesis was written. So again, no unique divine truth that changed the game for how people saw themselves, for how people viewed and treated and acted with each other. I just don't know how he can read this entire Bible and come away with something that he says is so profoundly, even if fictionally true, that we might as well call it true itself, which I think is the crux of the argument. The very last sentence of the chapter is, do we believe? When we falter in that commitment, catastrophe looms. Again, setting up the necessity for belief in what? Well, I just got done quoting all of Genesis for us. Apparently, this specific God concept. Here's what he says in the jacket. I took it off because it was making so much noise. These stories shape our very perceptions, but we do not yet understand their meaning. In consequence, we are tempted to presume their inadequacy. This is terribly dangerous in our era of exponentially expanding technology. It is therefore time for us to become more explicitly conscious of who we are and what we must serve. Backing all of that up, what's it go to? The fact that we don't yet understand these stories. Does that mean that he does? Is he the first person to crack the code on the meaning of Genesis? And how, by the way, if we don't understand the meaning, can the consequence be that we are tempted to presume their inadequacy? How do you know they're not inadequate? This is the same thing when people say you can't judge God. When I've said something negative about this God, I just point back, you're judging that he's good. You're judging God all the time. So if you can't understand it, you don't get to say that it's adequate or inadequate. You can't know that. And presuming something that was written thousands of years ago that has absolute scientific and historical errors in it, that is not unique amongst its time for its writing or its stories. Fine, we don't have to use the word inadequate, but not perfectly true, not perfectly useful, not something we should place in a hierarchical fashion above all else. Yeah, I think we actually do understand these stories enough to be able to say that. Acting like there's so much truth and mystery so profoundly hidden in these special lines that once acquired will show us the very essence of who we are and who we must serve is giving far too much credit to the Bible, and I think showing Jordan's hand very clearly. Again, if you really wanted to make a deistic argument to crush atheism, you should have used all the holy books. You should have used all the creation myths. You should have used all lore and mythology, but you tied your horse to this cart and it's going to cost you. The last thing that I'll show to you is a clip that came out yesterday of Jordan promoting his book. It's very short.
Why did I write We Who Wrestle with God? To awaken people to their conscience, to alert them to their calling, to explain to all who read, watch, and listen the meaning of the sacrifice that constitutes work itself, to invite them to the divine banquet, to slay the demons of pride, power, and hedonism, to invigorate the damaged spirit of the West. The revolution of tradition begins. Dare to wrestle with God.
So you might think it's corny or whatever, but I like this so much better than the other promotion of this book, which is that he will destroy the atheist argument permanently. If we're just wrestling with a particular God concept and going through the stories to pull out meaning for ourselves or look for maybe, yes, profound truths that can give us an edge in life, like you can do with all literature. He could have done this with one of his favorite books, the Brothers Karamazov. He could have pulled any individualistic Hindu text out of the library and we could have had the same conversation. We could simply do it with the first story that was ever told, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we could get all the same things. They're there. You want good philosophy to help you slay the demons of pride and power and hedonism? That's been done a lot and a lot better than just the biblical accounts. And so, hey, cool. The Bible has had a huge impact on the Western canon. And I think that understanding the Bible and understanding its influence and impact and the parallels and relations made back to it, because it's been such a significant work, I'm not denying that, is a really cool thing to understand. And he did this in his 1995 book, Maps of Meaning. That was pretty cool because he wasn't arguing for the truth value of it or the fact that it was so good it equaled truth. He wasn't propping up a god in general or trying to destroy atheism. He was saying, hey, these stories have done a lot. They've been around for a long time. Let's continue to investigate them and milk them for all they're worth. And I like that for the most part. So let's start closing this up. I'm a bit torn. I like reading the Bible. It's fascinating to me. It may not be for everyone else, that's fine. And I'm going to plug my secular Bible study series if you have not yet watched it. Maybe you're just here because of Jordan Peterson, where I go through the books from a more objective lens as someone who used to be Christian that is no longer saying, well, here's what it got wrong. Here's the contradictions. Here's some problematic passages. Here's some inconsistencies. Here's when it was written. Here's who authored it. Here's how we know. Here's why it's historically incorrect. But here's some of the things that it does get right. And here's some of the things that are interesting. So I can appreciate that angle of things. But we're going to take Jordan at his word, and we're going to continue to read this book as if it is his final fight against the tyranny and terror of atheism. So last thing, when can you find this series? I was previously doing Beyond the Bible. I'm still going to do that. I've also had a different series that's been on the shelf for a while, God, an Anatomy. And what I've decided is that Thursdays are going to be a placeholder for any time that we are critiquing a book. So whether it's Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book, or whether it's Jordan Peterson's book, or whether it's the non-Protestant canon books, on Thursday, you will see one of those come about. So every Thursday, 9 a.m. Central Time, we will be into one of those three, if not adding more in. Enjoy the chaos. Thanks for being here. I'll see you Sunday with a new video on context when it comes to the Bible. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris, GVI, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn; my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus; my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Lisa, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.